Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a topic that feels straight out of science fiction, but is very much here now.
Yeah, we're talking about the ethics of genetic interventions.
Especially with tools like CRISPR and this whole swirling debate around what it means to, well, enhance humanity itself.
It's definitely a space where the scientific pace is just dizzying, and the ethical, the societal questions are trying desperately to keep up.
Absolutely.
And we've got a fascinating stack of sources laid out for this, deep dive articles on CRISPR ethics, a really compelling case study. Pieces of an international convention on human rights and biomedicine, different perspectives on designer babies,
Right.
a surprisingly forceful argument for genetic enhancement, which is interesting, and even some recent public opinion data.
So our mission today, really try to cut through the complexity. We want to pull out the truly essential ethical questions these powerful technologies raise.
Understand the different viewpoints that are embedded in these sources.
Exactly. And give you, the listener, a clearer sense of this incredibly high-stakes landscape. Because it's full of potential breakthroughs, yes, but also some, profound concerns we all need to wrestle with.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The sources make it pretty clear that with technology like CRISPR, targeted genome editing isn't theoretical anymore.
Not at all.
It's a reality. It's being applied across biology.
Right. It's moved firmly from the lab bench into potential real-world applications. And it's extending beyond just basic research or treating very sort of simple genetic conditions.
But as those applications grow more sophisticated and potentially more widespread, the sources show that ethical concerns, some familiar, some totally new, are sparking these global debates about, well, just how far should we actually go?
Which leads straight to some foundational questions the sources keep highlighting, like how extensively should we even allow tools like CRISPR to be used in humans?
Yeah, that's number one. And if they are used,
then who gets access? Who actually gets access to these potentially transformative applications? Is it just going to be something the wealthy can afford?
that's a huge one. And then there's the question of whether our current rules, the ones for clinical research, are even equipped to handle all types of human genome editing.
Especially those changes that aren't just in one person, but could potentially be inherited, passed down through generations.
Exactly, that heritable stuff.
Which naturally raises that final point. Do we need new, maybe international rules to govern this technology, given its global reach and potential impact?
Yeah, these are kind of the bedrock questions, aren't they? Underlying everything else we're going to talk about.
And one of the biggest challenges in actually answering those questions, something the sources really emphasize, is the sheer uncertainty involved.
Oh, definitely. Predicting the long-term future of an organism after its genome have been edited.
Yeah.
Truly gauging the risks and benefits over decades, maybe even generations.
It's incredibly difficult, maybe impossible right now.
That uncertainty just complicates everything, doesn't it?
It really does, because even if you manage to achieve a perfect edit right at the specific spot you intended in the genome, the sources remind us that our understanding of the relationship between that genetic information and the complex biological traits we see, well, it's still far from complete.
Exactly right. Many traits we really care about, intelligence, personality, susceptibility to common diseases, they aren't controlled by one single gene.
No.
It's this intricate dance of many genes, these regulatory regions, sometimes far away on the DNA.
And environmental factors too, right?
Absolutely. Environmental factors, epigenetics, those changes in gene activity that don't even involve changing the DNA sequence itself.
Yeah.
It's layers upon layers.
So like trying to design or predict a complex outcome like behavior or intelligence at the whole organism level is, well, it's hugely challenging. We just don't understand the full system yet.
And that lack of understanding makes assessing the risks and benefits and therefore making the ethical decisions much, much tougher.
Beyond that sort of general cloud of uncertainty, the sources also point to several specific areas of concern that keep cropping up.
Yeah, there's the significant shadow of eugenics, for instance.
Which historically involved just horrifying practices aimed at improving populations, often based on deeply flawed and discriminatory ideas.
Right. And the sources do try to differentiate this classical eugenics from some modern ideas of liberal eugenics.
Which is framed more around individual or parental choice, maybe pursuing genetic changes for personal reasons. Still controversial, but different from the state-sponsored stuff.
Definitely. Then there were also serious concerns about how these technologies could potentially exacerbate existing societal problems, like racism and inequality.
That access question again.
Exactly. And the potential for, theoretical risks to ecosystems if modified organisms were ever released.
Yeah.
Plus the broader risk of just general misuse.
And one specific kind of emotionally charged concern mentioned in the sources is the ethics around creating a child, not just for their own sake, but primarily to provide biological material like cord blood stem cells for another person.
The savior-sibling scenario.
Right. The sources bring up the case of Molly Nash, who was conceived using PGD to be a match for her older brother, to illustrate just how complex that situation is.
Yeah, very complex. Access to these technologies is another major flashpoint that comes up repeatedly.
And it's interesting because the CRISPR tool itself, the basic technology, is described as relatively inexpensive and widely available in labs.
Right. But the applications built on that tool, the actual therapies, the diagnostic approaches, they can be incredibly expensive. Prohibitively so.
Which immediately raises alarms about potential price gouging and just creates this huge barrier to access.
And that fairness and distribution issue, it goes beyond just fancy therapies in wealthy nations, right?
How do we make sure that potential benefits, like, say, crops fortified with essential nutrients using CRISPR?
Yeah, like golden rice or something similar.
How do we ensure those benefits can actually reach people who need them most, maybe in resource-limited parts of the world? And how can companies even figure out a way to make that economically viable? Big questions.
Huge questions. Okay, shifting gears a bit to how this is being handled, regulation-wise.
Right. When it comes to regulating human genome editing, particularly in clinical research, some countries do already have frameworks in place.
And if something does go wrong in a trial, legal routes for compensation do exist, depending on where you are.
A really crucial distinction, though, in both the regulations and the ethical debate is between editing somatic cells.
So changes that only affect the individual treated.
Exactly, versus editing germline cells.
Where the changes are heritable. They can be passed down to future generations. That's the key difference.
And current gene therapy largely focuses on those somatic cells, trying to treat diseases in the person right here, right now.
Yeah, and the sources note that clinical trials using CRISPR for those kinds of therapies are actually showing improved safety compared to some past gene therapy approaches that had some pretty serious setbacks years ago.
Okay, so progress on the somatic front. But that heritable germline editing, that's where the controversy is really intense, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The vast majority of scientific, medical, and industry bodies, one source mentioned over 60 statements, they mostly agree it should be prohibited. Right now, at least.
Prohibited now. But is there wiggle room?
Well, the sources also reference reports from places like the Netherlands, the UK, Spain, and a key one from the NASEM committee in the U.S.
NASEM being the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine.
Right. And these reports suggest that it could potentially be acceptable in the future, but only under extremely strict conditions.
And what kind of conditions are we talking about? Like really strict?
Extremely strict. They include things like it must be the only reasonable option available. No other way to have a healthy child, for example. Used only to prevent a serious disease or condition.
Yeah.
Not for enhancement.
Right.
Limited to editing genes that are definitively known to cause or strongly predisposed to that specific disease.
So high confidence about the gene's role.
Very high. And changing genes only to versions that are already common in the general population and known to be associated with ordinary health. So no creating totally novel gene variants.
Got it. What else?
Having credible preclinical and clinical data on the risks and potential benefits before even starting trials, rigorous ongoing oversight during any trials,
and follow-up.
Comprehensive long-term follow-up, and this is key, across generations, while still somehow respecting privacy, which is a huge practical challenge.
Okay.
Plus, maximum transparency, continuous reassessment of the benefits and risks with public input factored in, and reliable oversight to make absolutely sure it doesn't creep beyond preventing serious disease.
It sounds like an incredibly high bar. It's a roadmap emphasizing extreme caution and public accountability every step of the way.
Exactly. But despite all that fear of misuse, the sources do acknowledge arguments for allowing carefully controlled germline editing research.
Such as
Potentially protecting future embryos from inheriting really devastating genetic defects, or maybe even aiming, down the line, to eliminate certain terrible diseases from family lines entirely.
Okay. And this brings us, I think, to what feels like the most fundamental philosophical split in this entire discussion.
Which is?
The difference between using genetic technology to treat disease, to fix something wrong, versus using it to enhance human capabilities beyond what we currently consider normal.
Yes, the therapy versus enhancement line. And the sources lay out very different positions here.
Like the American Medical Association.
Yeah, their code of ethics, cited in one source, draws a pretty firm line. They seem to reserve genetic manipulation strictly for therapeutic purposes.
So fixing problems.
Right. They view the enhancement of traits, even supposedly desirable ones, as something contrary to the core tradition and goals of medicine.
Okay, so they see a clear boundary there. Fixing versus improving. But you mentioned earlier there was another source with a dramatically different view.
Oh, very different. This other source argues that the line between therapy and enhancement is actually pretty blurry, maybe even arbitrary sometimes.
Yeah.
And perhaps, they argue, it's not even the most important ethical consideration anyway. It makes the provocative case that we might even have a moral obligation to enhance ourselves and our children.
A moral obligation to enhance. Where does that reasoning come from?
Their argument is rooted in the principle of beneficence, the ethical idea that we should act to benefit people, to increase well-being.
Right.
So if biological enhancement can genuinely increase someone's opportunities for a better life, better well-being, more success, then this perspective suggests we should pursue it when we can do it safely.
And they try to frame it consistently with things we already do.
Exactly. That's a key part of their argument. They say, look, we already accept and encourage environmental interventions to improve lives, better nutrition, education, training, even things like caffeine to improve alertness, or drugs like Prozac or Ritalin to alter mood and focus. All of these interventions impact our biology, our brain chemistry.
It's true.
So they ask, why is a direct biological intervention using genetics somehow fundamentally different or uniquely wrong if the goal is the same, improving well-being?
Do they give specific examples of traits we might want to enhance?
They do. They talk about traits that clearly affect well-being. Things like impulse control, referencing the famous marshmallow test.
Where kids who delayed gratification did better later in life.
Right. They mention intelligence, pointing to the Flynn effect, the documented rise in average IQ scores over generations, showing that traits we value can be influenced, at least environmentally.
All right.
They even cite examples like maybe reducing predisposition to extreme aggression, referencing a Dutch family case with a specific gene mutation linked to violence, or even traits related to mood regulation or memory, things people already tried to influence through other means.
So from this enhancement positive perspective, they argue that failing to enhance a child's capacities, when it's safe and possible, could actually be seen as wrong, like similar to neglecting their education or health.
That's the core of their argument. Failing to take an available opportunity to increase their chance at a good life might be morally questionable.
Wow. Okay, but of course, the sources also present the significant counter-arguments to this whole idea of enhancement.
Oh, absolutely. Many counter-arguments. A common one is just the feeling that it's against human nature, or it's hubristic tampering, maybe an affront to human dignity.
Sort of playing God.
That kind of sentiment, yes. This view often suggests enhancement comes from this overly confident desire to control and master nature, and it diminishes our ability to appreciate life as it's given, with all its imperfections.
And then there are the very practical societal concerns about inequality and discrimination, which I touched on earlier with access.
Precisely. If enhancements are expensive, which they almost certainly would be initially,
they could create this stark division, a genetic stratification between the enhanced and the unenhanced.
Yeah, potentially creating a whole new form of inequality.
Yeah.
And this is particularly concerning with what economists call positional goods.
Like height.
Like height, or maybe certain aspects of intelligence in highly competitive settings. Things where one person's gain comes at the relative expense of others.
Yeah.
If I get taller, I might have an advantage in basketball over you if you don't also get taller.
Though the counterargument mentioned in the sources is that society already deals with vast natural inequalities in talent and ability.
Right.
And our institutions should ideally be designed to protect the disadvantaged and ensure fairness, regardless of whether the inequality is natural or technologically created.
That's the ideal, yes.
Yeah.
And there's also the practical point that some enhancements might be sort of self-defeating if everyone pursues them.
The height example again.
Exactly. If everyone enhanced their height by 6 inches, the average just goes up, the relative advantage disappears, and maybe we just end up with taller basketball hoops and doorways.
And new problems we didn't anticipate.
Potentially. And another really crucial ethical perspective raised in the sources is the debate around whether selecting against certain disabilities through genetic screening or editing.
Implies a judgment or disvalue for the lives of people currently living with those disabilities. That's a really sensitive point.
Very sensitive and very important.
The idea of parental reproductive autonomy also comes up a lot here, right? The freedom parents feel to make choices they believe are best for their own children.
Yes, that's central to the enhancement debate, especially liberal eugenics perspective. But the sources also quickly note that these individual reproductive choices don't happen in a vacuum.
They can have broader societal impacts.
Exactly, suggesting there's this inherent tension between individual freedom and collective responsibility that needs careful balancing.
Okay, let's step back and look at the international picture for a moment. Our sources included excerpts from the Council of Europe's Oviedo Convention. That was from 1997, right?
Yes, almost 30 years ago now, but still a landmark. It's a significant international framework focused specifically on protecting human rights and dignity in the face of advances in biology and medicine.
And what are some key things it says?
Well, it strongly emphasizes informed consent for any medical intervention. That's foundational.
Of course.
And it has specific protections for people unable to consent, like children or those with cognitive impairments. It generally requires a direct benefit to that individual and proper authorization.
Which connects back to that case study we mentioned earlier about the mother refusing genetic testing for her 5-year-old daughter, Emma, even though the testing could have potentially guided palliative care.
Right. The mother sought legal advice, highlighting the complex rights and decision-making involved when someone can't consent for themselves. The convention provides a framework for thinking about that.
What else does Oviedo say?
It explicitly prohibits discrimination based on someone's genetic heritage. It places limits on predictive genetic tests, saying they should generally only be for health or scientific research purposes, and always require appropriate genetic counseling.
Okay. And crucially, what about genome editing itself?
Article 13 addresses that directly. It states that interventions on the human genome are permitted only for preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic purposes.
So treatment or prevention.
And this is the key part. Must not introduce any modification in the genome of any descendants. In other words, no heritable changes.
So a strong stance against germline editing, right there in an international treaty from back in 97.
A very clear line drawn. It also prohibits sex selection, except when it's necessary to avoid a serious hereditary sex-related disease.
Right.
And research on individuals who can't consent has very strict conditions attached, typically requiring the research to hold out the potential of direct benefit to that person's health.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of the formal international legal perspective, at least from Europe. Finally, let's touch on what the public thinks about all of this. We had some polling data in the sources.
Yes, according to that data, public acceptance of gene editing for babies seems to vary quite a bit, depending on the specific purpose.
How so?
Well, people seem significantly more accepting if the gene editing is framed as treating an existing serious congenital disorder that the baby would be born with.
Compared to
using it just to reduce the risk of a disease that might or might not develop much later in life, like heart disease or certain cancers. There's less support for that.
Interesting. Does religion play a role?
It does seem to. The data suggested that people who report being highly religious are generally less likely to view gene editing for babies as appropriate across the board.
Okay. And what about science knowledge?
That also seems to matter. People with higher levels of self-reported science knowledge tend to be more accepting of gene editing for babies overall, regardless of the specific purpose presented in the poll questions.
So purpose, religiosity, science, literacy, all seem to shape public views.
Okay, reflecting on everything we've just unpacked here, what really stands out from digging into these sources is just the incredible power now at our fingertips with genetic technologies like CRISPR.
Yeah, the power is immense, and the ethical and societal questions they force us to confront are equally profound.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how the scientific challenges like the sheer complexity and unpredictability of gene function that we talked about are so deeply intertwined with these very concrete ethical concerns.
Concerns around potential misuse, ensuring equitable access, figuring out what's fair.
Yeah. And we've seen that intense global debate swirling around heritable germline, editing the general consensus against it for now, but also that possibility raised by some expert bodies that it could maybe be permissible someday under those incredibly stringent conditions.
And we've really wrestled with that deep philosophical divide. Is the goal simply to treat illness, to fix what's broken?
Or do we open the door to actually enhancing human capabilities? Maybe even feeling a kind of moral push to do so despite all those significant worries about inequality, human dignity, and how we even define what's normal or good.
We also saw how existing international frameworks, like Oviedo, are trying to grapple with these issues, emphasizing human rights and trying to draw lines.
And how public opinion isn't monolithic either. It's shaped by the specifics, the why of the intervention, people's underlying beliefs, and maybe even how much science they feel they understand.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this? I think it means navigating this space isn't about finding one single static answer. It just can't be.
No, it's got to be a dynamic process, one that evolves alongside the science itself. It means constantly weighing the uncertainty, the issues of access and safety.
And balancing those against our most fundamental human values. Dignity, autonomy, fairness, and maybe even wrestling with what we think it really means for a human to thrive.
So maybe consider this as we wrap up. If our biology truly has such a profound impact on our opportunities for well-being, for living a good life,
Which it undeniably does.
and if technology now grants us the power to deliberately influence that biology, perhaps in very beneficial ways, are we then morally compelled to use that power?
Or are there fundamental, perhaps even inherent, limits to genetic intervention that we should never cross, regardless of the potential benefits we might see?
That's something for you to continue thinking about.